Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of the Workplace Wanderer Lessons from the Experts. Today, we have an interesting twist on our normal conversations. Usually, we're talking about leadership. Today, we are talking about followership, or as I like to call it, power of the people. For today's show, I have a friend and a fellow cohort member in the doctoral program that I'm in, Annie Laing. Welcome, Annie.
Hey, thanks for having me. It's fun to be here today.
I'm so glad you're here. I always enjoy talking to you. Um, at one point during one of our residencies, you broke out in song. You have such like an interesting background and such a mix. I think you even referred to yourself sort of as like a Jill of all trades. At one point,
Right.
you
Yeah,
sort of
sort
have
of.
a very diverse background that gives you skills in a bunch of different areas. So I'm just interested in talk to you. And this topic is very interesting as well because we don't normally cover it.
Right. Right. Yeah, I think that's one reason I thought it'd be interesting to talk with you about it, having kind of gone through courses with you and gotten to discuss this. But it is something we just don't hear about. There, all the leadership books in the world that you can find and kind of self-help towards the best type of leader you can be. Um, but there are very few about the best type of follower you can be. I find that fascinating, especially in a doctoral program where people inevitably kind of look up to you as a knowledge expert, but how do we then kind of steward that toward being the best followers we can possibly be in our fields? And I find it fascinating. So excited to talk
It
about it more with you.
it is really interesting. And so I just kind of want to comment first that to anybody who's listening, to my one listener, it's interesting with this podcast, and I hope people find it informational and useful to them. But it's sort of like I'm bringing you along on this doctoral journey as I'm learning and I'm bringing information to you guys. It's really because that I'm learning it, or I found it interesting in one class that we took. And typically the guests that we're having on are people who are either fellow cohort members or people in the field who've been doing this type of work for a long time that are discussing topics that I've learned about that I'm just fascinated by. So first, I just want to say that to the people who are listening. Two, on the followership thing, one, it was really interesting that it was one of the first classes we took was leadership and followership. And they
Mhm.
introduced it to us right away. The other thing that I had noticed with it was how every single article that we read that discussed followership all brought up the idea that there's so much information out there on leadership theory, but nothing on followership theory.
Exactly. Yeah. It was really actually we kind of joke amongst ourselves of how difficult that course was, but I completely loved it.
Mhm.
Um, Probably for the reason that it was absolutely mind blowing to me. I was in a contract at the time with a local nonprofit where I was sitting in an executive seat for a period of time, and as I was learning all of this, I started to apply it to the role I was in and really challenging my thinking on how am I, as the named leader in this scenario, encouraging those I am over to be the best followers, and how am I allowing that to influence how I'm leading? And so they were starting to get potentially some of the best of my leadership toward the end of my contract, where
Yeah.
because it had a set deadline, and it was in the middle of our semester. And so but yeah, it was just pretty mind-blowing to consider. And so maybe we should kind of talk with the listeners about even the concepts of what followership is versus leadership.
Yeah, I think that would be great. I think um, it seems obvious, but it's really not.
Mhm.
You just assume, okay, well, obviously, if there's a leader, there has to be followers, but there's so much more to it. So I'm curious, in your mind or your interpretation, how do you define followership?
Well, I think I would probably actually define it how you might define it, just thinking about what that means, as in someone is following another person. And I love, there's a YouTube video where a man is saying all it takes to transform a lone nut into a leader is a follower.
Mhm.
And it's so true. And so all it takes is you have someone who is either on board with your mission or your passion or your energy, or just needing a job, and they come alongside you and all of a sudden you're a leader. um, and but you're only a leader because you have someone following what you are trying to carry forward. And that can be, if you're married, how are you, and the way that you are taking leadership over an issue in your home, helping your spouse to follow that.
Mhm.
And are you doing that in such a way that brings them up in
Yes.
their abilities in the world, just as an individual? And so it can be literally, it's not just a business principle. This is how do I walk in and handle my interaction with the barista who's taking my order, and so in a sense kind of following what I'm needing, and is my interaction with them creating the best possible scenario for them to thrive in their job as they get me what I need and what I've asked for. um so it can just be applied everywhere. So that's what I say when it's mind-blowing. I'm like, this just challenges, though, I suppose, my sense of kind of self and self-management, because as a follower, am I also following others in such a way that their leadership is enhanced, and are they leading in such a way that I am allowed to be the best type of colleague and follower that I can possibly be. So I don't know if that answered your question, because it's kind of nebulous to me
No,
in
I
its
loved it.
simplicity.
You brought up it's almost like a leadership theory inception. Like it just goes so deep, and we as humans, we're always interchanging between being a leader follower, depending on the context of the situation that we're in. That's
Hmm.
it's really an interesting way to look at it. And I think speaks to why understanding followership, regardless of whether you are an employee or you are the CEO of the company, is really important, because there's going to be times where you have to let others take the lead. And how do you do that well? How do you support the person who's in the lead position to the best of your ability so that you can get the best result?
Right, exactly. And I kind of took some time while we were initially in the studying a bunch of this last semester, to really think back on my personal professional journey. And you're right, it's a bit varied. A little more about me in a nutshell is my first two degrees were in voice and opera performance, and that world was my world. Everything about music, teaching, performing was my world for the first now half of my career.
Right.
And then I made a hard pivot, which is a longer story for another day, but I made a hard pivot out of music entirely and into the corporate space, which has been a bit of just a trial and error journey, finding out that I had skills outside of those needed in the music field that fit organizational operations really well. And I didn't know that when I first went into the field or into corporate life. So it was interesting to get to learn that. But as I kind of consider both aspects of my full career, I can think back and note very specifically when there were leaders or professors, bosses that enabled me to find the best of myself that I can offer this world, that perhaps I didn't even know was a thing. I didn't know that that was a skill that I had. It's just, when you have wild skills, they're normal to you, but they're not normal to other people
Sure. Yeah.
experiencing them. And so I had very specific leaders who were able to pointedly call those out and give them room. And on the flip side, I've also worked in organizations where the leader I was following did not seem to have either capacity or awareness to allow that space, which is not necessarily a judgment on them. Because again, this kind of concept is not taught. So we're taught about leadership principles, which often equal certain types of character qualities. But there were certain ones that didn't have the capacity
Yeah.
to bring out those things in myself and give them permission and room, which often requires an ability to let go of your control over the person who's growing, which can be, I'm sure, terrifying in the vulnerability of leadership and how much it's going to land on you if they fail. Um, but I'm so grateful to the ones who allowed me to fail and stumble forward and were willing to kind of bear that cost so that I could grow and flourish as a follower. And now
Yeah.
in my book of life, they are credited. Um, where I've reached out to some of them to be, I am who I am because you allowed this to
Wow.
happen. And oh, I mean, is that not what hopefully we all exist to make others better.
Well,
So
and that's what they say is the best sign of a true leader is that we leave people better than we found them. And we
mhm,
don't pigeonhole them, we don't keep them into a box. I think the reality is there's a lot of onus on the follower to be able to take the experiences, whether it's a good leader or a bad leader, and to grow from them. And that is part of followership as well as being able to have that same situational awareness and saying, okay, this is the situation I'm in currently. Um, how do I learn from this situation? How do I get better from it? And it does require taking on certain leadership principles like the situational awareness and emotional intelligence and saying, okay, this is the
mhm,
situation that I'm in. This is how I'm going to make the best of it. This is how I'm going to grow from this. Or I have to get out of this situation because it's not in line with my values and beliefs, whatever it may be.
yeah,
Um, so I mean, you unpacked a lot there that I think is really, really interesting to me. And it also reminded me of one thing is that some people are really good followers. And I think really good followers are often promoted to leadership positions, but being a good follower doesn't always make you a good leader. And it
right,
sounds like maybe in some of those situations that you were in before, these people were put into leadership positions because they were really good at following. They were really good at doing a
yeah,
job, really good at following their leader's advice or following their leader's commands, if you want to say. But once they got into that leadership position, they lacked the leadership skills as opposed to followership skills to actually thrive in those positions.
right. And that's quite possible. It's quite possible. I can't quite say, and I would never want to make a
Of
judgment
course.
call on someone else's journey specifically, but it is quite possible, and it does kind of bring up the idea of how are we or those who are put in leadership positions to think about succession and staffing needs and um, employee development
Yes.
tracks, paths, who has the skills that are kind of all encompassing and who has the potential to not just be an excellent follower, but within the whole of who they are, do they also both possess and want
Yeah.
the things that will be necessary for them to be an excellent leader? And you're right. I think there's often I forget the word that there's just a known or not a known, but it's kind of a given. If you have these kind of qualities and you do this in your job, then sometimes you'll be seen as the high potential and people have their eye on you and want to
Yeah.
raise you up. But that doesn't necessarily mean you actually they want that, or we're kind of wired to want that in this pursuit of being a leader.
Right. Exactly.
But there's something really wonderful about the people that I've worked with, and certain faces are flashing through my mind even now of some of the most wonderful followers on some of these staffs that I've worked with. And they're people who are excellent at what they do. They're easy and fun to work with. They don't have the ambition of climbing up roles. necessarily, but they are what hold a business together and what value there is in that. And so then how are they cared for in such a way that
Yeah.
they can be promoted within their scope of desire and giftedness?
Yeah.
Um,
I
so I
I
think my
agree.
little HR background is kind of coming in. I'm like, oh yes, how do we develop the people to be their best where they're suited to be instead of pushing them outside potentially of what they're actually best skilled to do for our world and for our companies and our colleagueship, you know?
Yeah, I mean, those people are extraordinarily important. And I think about them often, and I don't know, I almost hesitate to call them, to put them in the box of followers or followership, because they're almost leaders in their own right, because they are so important to the organization within their roles. So whether they have a formal role or not, a formal leadership role or not, it doesn't really matter, because they're so impactful on the people around them. And I think if we all took a second to just think, we all know somebody who in a job you were just like, wow, that person's awesome. And they never wanted to be promoted. They wanted to just stay in their role, enjoy that role, make the most of it. They had so much fun doing it. They brought joy to other people around them. And that's it. They're content with that. And they just hope they get their, 5% raise every year
Mhm,
and just stay in that role forever. But it's important to consider it and be in tune with, as a leader, with your followers and the people who are in your organization, to know what their wants and desires are. Um, and I want to go back just for one quick second, just to note, when I said about people being really good followers but not being great leaders, I actually don't mean that in a sense of good and bad or right and wrong. I sort of just look at it as fact. And that means that
mhm,
typically something was missing from the situation, that a good follower was put into a leadership position without the proper training. I don't fault the person who's the leader. I think they were put into it, and then they're just acting based on what they think a good leader should act like, and they don't really know.
right.
They're overwhelmed. They're frustrated. They've never managed people, or all the paperwork and bureaucracy that goes along with it. Like, they haven't had those skills taught to them. So they're just floundering. And they were given that role, though, because they were really good at their job. And now they're like, well, I don't even get to do my job anymore. Now I'm in this position. I don't feel I don't feel well equipped for. And
Mhm,
that speaks to just why I think we do what we do. I think there's such an importance, or at least what I want to do, there's such an importance in leadership skills training and preparing somebody
exactly.
mentally to have those skills, which I think for the most part, are people skills, is what most leaders need. Of
Often.
course, there's technical, but I think for the
Mhm,
most part, good leaders, really effective leaders, need really strong people skills. They need to know how to communicate and to be mindful and to be empathetic and to listen and to pump other people up. And that to me is the sign of a great leader, but also somebody who belongs in a leadership role.
mm. Yeah. That's a good thought. I can as you were talking, I was like, "Oh, that's me." Because there have been elements where I've been thrusted so many times actually in my life and career. It's been kind of the sink or swim. You're thrown in the deep end, learn this fast. Fail fast, learn fast, get better. And there's an element of that I tend to thrive in. So I wonder if that's maybe why I get kind of thrust there so often. However, there were times when I would have a sit down with an advisor or perhaps someone over me leading different initiatives where I was like, here is my white flag. I have failed this and I have
Mm,
absolutely no idea what I did wrong. Not a clue. I did everything I knew to do. I had little guidance, and so I did my best. And I
yeah.
think I'm drowning. Like I'm literally going down in this deep end. There's no swimming. What
Yeah.
have I done? And so I think you're right because it was I wouldn't say humiliating, although my pride in that moment was absolutely devastated because I had to admit I have no idea what to do and I don't even know what question I need to ask to
Mm.
have done this differently, to improve now? What am I supposed to do? Do we just can it and start all over and cut the loss?
Yeah.
And just me admit that, because I'll admit that, but we're still left with needing to reach this goal. What am I supposed to do? And so, there takes an element of kind of brave humility as the follower to seek out what we don't know. And that can be really difficult when we're in inevitably, because we all will be at least at one point in situations where we're called to do really difficult things with very little guidance, and often sometimes um, little encouragement, like, oh, you can do it, here's your deadline, you're good at this, we've seen you do it, you go for it. And you're getting through and it's not going well. So how do we position ourselves? We're following what we've been told to do while we're also leading what we've been put over to lead. And how do we choose to embrace the humility and seek out the answers when we don't have them and no one else is going to give them? And I think that's been a hard part of my leadership journey, is just figuring out when I'm tasked with doing something and I finally come to a point of realizing I have no idea what I'm doing. Am I willing to just reach out to anyone who can help me and admit, I don't know how to do this anymore and I need a lot of help? Um, so I
It's a
think that you're
familiar
right.
feeling, by the way. Very
I don't think
recently,
we're alone.
I think I've been feeling that a lot recently of like, I don't know what I'm doing. I'm just floundering. I don't need, sometimes you get to the point where you just don't even know how to ask for help. Like you said, you don't even know the right question to ask to help move you along. Just sort of like,
Mhm.
hey, this is where I'm at. This doesn't feel right. What should I do here?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I don't think we're alone. I think I feel like I read at some point that even those at the very top get there, and it's a bit of the fake it till you make it game. You know enough to have been put in this position, and so can you just like duke it out and get there?
Yeah,
But I
right.
think once that door closes and we have a moment of pause, we can be like, I am faking it and no one knows and it's working. How is this working?
Yeah.
You know, and all of our success is built on we're trying. We're at least willing. So I feel that.
I have to wonder then, are you really faking it or do you actually know and you just think you're faking it? If it's working, you're not
Yeah.
clearly not faking it. We're acting from a place of skill and knowledge.
Yeah.
We
And is
just
that actually more of what real life actually looks like as we navigate these leader and followership places? Is it actually more that I thought I knew what I was doing? I'm not sure I quite know enough, but we're doing it anyway based on that skill and knowledge,
yeah.
and it's working. And it's just incredibly vulnerable if we rip away some of the facade of knowledge and skill to know that it is only knowledge and skill that's getting me by, you know,
Yeah.
which feels very scary and vulnerable. And so
It almost
I
becomes
that's why
instinct. The knowledge and
yeah.
skill sort of becomes instinct, but because you don't know how to solve a particular problem, it feels like we don't know what we're doing, but yet somehow we get through. That
Yeah.
imposters. I mean, to me, I'm hearing imposter syndrome a little bit of not recognizing our capability or also just a sort of natural part of the human existence of if a problem is coming to us and we had an immediate answer to it, would it really be a problem?
Mm,
Probably not. So that's the whole point, is that like what we're training for in our careers in school and whatever it is that we're doing is we're training ourselves to think differently, not to
mhm.
have all the answers.
That's true. Yeah.
That may make no sense. I don't know, but we'll just ride with that one.
Yeah. Well, I think there's an element of truth in that though, where we don't have all the answers and we run in that's why consultancy exists, because the systems are fascinating to me. And then how our minds work within systems is just fascinating to me.
Yeah.
But there are systems everywhere. We're all part of many of them, and we're part of one whole one is the human race, and everything is connected, and it's very, very complicated. And so when one little piece of the system gets off kilter or just totally breaks or is um, a result of poor alignment or whoever knows all of the reasons, something breaks and it affects kind of like the rippling dominoes. There's a lot that touches that in the end, even though
Yeah.
you might not have put those together and it's broken. And we don't know how to fix that. And it takes a long time. And maybe you knew at a certain point, and now you don't. And that's a big part of it.
Yeah.
So I think that you're onto something there. There's a lot of not knowing.
Yeah. I wouldn't say I'm onto it. I'd say we're onto it because I think we both got to those conclusions together. So I want to jump back to the topic of followership. There was an article we actually had to read for this semester that I thought was really interesting. That was all about, let's see, I actually have it open. Was really about having the best possible relationship with your superiors. And it was focused more on the follower side of things that basically says that a relationship that you have with your leader, your boss, your manager, whatever it may be, is the onus is not only on the leader to make that relationship good. And of course, they have an important piece to it, but there's also onus on the employee themselves or the follower in this case to help communicate appropriately and to build that relationship and to adapt their style to their boss.
Mm,
We hear so often people complain about their boss. My boss sucks because this. My boss sucks because of that. They're such an ass. They're this, they're that. And they don't recognize their part in that relationship and realize that they may have to do some adapting. It's that maybe their boss isn't a jerk. Maybe they're approaching their boss in the wrong possible way. And if they want to be successful and content in their position, maybe they need to adapt themselves.
mm,
I think bosses get an unfair beating from a lot of people, and they usually take the brunt of a lot of the blame. And people
mhm,
like to hate on their boss, and it can be a very thankless position. I
mm,
I don't think that that's necessarily healthy. I think it's okay to complain about your boss. I think that that's normal. We all have complaints about our parents, or whatever it is. We always complain about our president, for example.
mhm.
Um, but I do think we have to have an ability to take a look in the mirror and realize, like, what role are we playing in that relationship that may be
Mm.
detrimental to my success and to the leader's success. Right? Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah, it does. And it kind of makes me think of a couple things when you said earlier how important the employee development actually is. Um, how much are we helping if we have, and I say that because sometimes I've been in the roles of HR or direct supervisory function. So in those spaces, have I helped them understand me? And do I have that awareness that they don't understand how to even relate to me? Is there a way that I can help with that? Um, but it also makes me think of another article that we read last semester that presented the idea of ambidextrous leadership. And the first time
Hmm.
I read that, I thought, oh, how very brainy we are.
I know.
But
Yes,
getting into it,
ambidextrous.
it was ambidextrous.
I
But,
think that was the first
and
article they had us read.
it might have been,
I'm pretty sure it
honestly, we've
was.
read so much,
Yeah.
they all start blending to one giant article in my brain. But the idea of ambidexterity is that you're gifted with the right hand and you're gifted with the left hand. So in a leadership followership context is at all times you are both. And so to your point, it ought to be both, that a follower is demonstrating leadership abilities or characteristics when they adjust to the need of the boss,
Mhm.
just like the leader is adjusting to follow what the follower needs. And so there's this real cycle of following and leading where we're kind of bending, and it's not a total um oh, what's the word? Another time we might need to edit this part.
Okay.
What's that word? Compromise.
Compromise. We made it
And
far
so
for the having the first
yeah.
edit. So where do we
Yeah.
want to restart there? So it's maybe start with it's not a total compromise. So
Oh, right, right.
just
Okay.
so I can edit it smoother.
Sure. All right.
So go with.
Very good. So it's not a total compromise necessarily, but it is a bending to suit the needs of the other. And in that way, I think that's what possibly has been so mind-blowing to me, because that speaks to a quality of both leadership and my ability to follow well. If I'm constantly thinking that this is going back and forth and we're just swirling together in this kind of a wild dance
Mhm.
of teaming. And what is excellent teaming is we're kind of, you're letting me lead by telling you what I need as your follower, and you're bending to that, and then you're listening, so taking leadership of that, and then I come and bring you something, and all of a sudden I'm leading the conversation to help us move. And it's just this dance of moving forward that ultimately I think leads both to success.
Yeah.
And there's something really wonderful about that, but we don't consider that.
I so this is something I think about often is that we call it leadership, we call it followership, but the truth is that it's a relationship. And
Mm,
that requires like any if you're a relationship counselor, you're going to advise people that they need to have compromise with each other. There has to be trust. They have to understand each other's strengths and weaknesses. They have to have a give and take and know when to lead and know when to follow. They have to have good communication skills. Really, what we're talking about is allowing information to flow between leader and follower appropriately so that you can build that relationship towards a greater goal. For a relationship, maybe it's marriage. That's your goal, is to
mhm.
have a successful marriage. But in an organization, that relationship leads to a successful mission accomplishments, or leading to hitting a goal, or to having a successful company. That relationship piece of it is so important, and it requires you to understand the other people within the dynamics of the relationship. It's just more like maybe like a polyamorous relationship, because there's multiple people involved in this relationship. Um, so, but it requires in those events, I can only imagine what a person in a polyamorous relationship must go through, because they have to get to know each other's, everybody's strengths, weaknesses, wants, needs, desires, and then try to navigate those and infuse them all together and sort of use them almost as puzzle pieces to figure out where everybody goes in this system.
Mhm.
We may
Yeah.
be way off track, by the way. I don't even know, but it made sense in my mind.
Well, I mean, I don't think you're wrong, and I think that's one. uh, I mean, I would imagine that would have to be a part of such a relationship in order to make it work. Otherwise, it's too difficult. Like, just listening to you, I'm like, that sounds exhausting. And isn't that leadership?
Yeah, well,
Like,
and then
I'm
that's the thing is
I'm
like, yeah, it's hard. It's hard.
yeah, it's hard, and it takes either a chosen desire, or just a knowledge that this you need to be able to care enough to learn those things about your team.
Hmm,
And so even if it's not like, I love people, I love figuring out how people communicate and helping them communicate better with me, and the people dynamic just drives me. But it doesn't drive everybody. And
right.
so how, you know, how tiring it must be extra for someone like that, or perhaps someone who's an introverted leader, where every interaction is slowly chipping away at what you have to give, pure and simple. And yet you still need to muster up or budget your time or some way, because maybe you understand that this really is valuable for the success of you as the lead and your whole team as a whole.
Yeah.
So
No, it's such a good point, and it makes so much sense. And what I'm pulling from what you're saying is that how little room there is for ego in the
mm,
workplace if you want to have a successful team dynamic and flow between leaders and followers, is you have to really know yourself enough, but also know the people around you and know when it's time for you to step aside and let somebody else shine.
mm,
There was another article that we read, I remember, that was a bit extremist that I didn't necessarily agree with the way that they put it, but pulling out the parts that I liked of it was, it was basically that it was proposing a system where there is no formal leader, and that the leader themselves, do you remember this one where they switched depending on the context of the situation and their individual strengths? There was some
mm,
philosophy that everybody's a leader and follower in the system, and that
mhm,
depending on what has to be done in the task, you switch it up and you say, okay, you'll be really good at navigating this task because it's very tech heavy and you're very tech savvy,
mhm,
whatever. So that was another one to me that I thought was really interesting. I don't think that that model would necessarily work. It'd be chaotic in most systems. There'd be a lot of
mhm,
fighting. But I think having a similar model of what you're talking about is having like a formal leader, and then letting that leader know the strengths of each one of their followers and when they can shine, and saying, hey, this job is really going to be great for you. I think that you should be in this role for this period and you should take the lead here. I'm going to take a back seat and I'm going to be a good follower now.
mhm.
So,
Yeah, it would certainly present different options. So I remember two different scenarios kind of come to mind. I was in an organization where I was the HR lead over their HR, and it was a smaller organization. And so a whole system change was a little bit easier to manage, but they moved into a whole different organizational model to where it moved into a flat structure. But within the flat structure, there were specific point people that were kind of the chosen and volunteered expert for their section, and they would liaise with the other
mm,
sections, and it can work. But that was a 6-month organizational change that we had to manage that for every single team and every single person, so that everyone would have the understanding and the buy-in and the knowledge of their role in this new structure, and that allowed it to work quite well. So it's fascinating to watch, because that was the first time I was kind of part of a flat structure in that way. There was still the CEO and there was still a leadership team, but the way they sat on an org chart was now flat, and their role within that was a little more, you're more like the SME model. We're all subject matter experts and
okay.
equal among peers in this kind of a system. But in the end, the buck will still stop with that one if we
Right.
have to. But it could work. But it took so much work to get there.
And that's sort of
And
what I'm talking
then,
about. Like, I think that
yeah.
model can work. And I think it's actually really important because it allows people to feel valued, and feel like they don't have some like looming boss over their head. That everybody's collaborative and working together. And
Hmm.
to me, it makes a little bit more sense. But I think in the end, the model that we read about was like there is no official leader. It's just sort of like, all right, who's going to lead this project now? I like what you're talking about, and that makes a lot of sense. There's people there who are sort of there to guide and to say, hey, I know what to do in this situation. Here's some information about that, or to somebody to take responsibility or to have the vision to move the company forward. I think
Hmm.
it's interesting.
Uh, so it speaks to the need for personal maturity of everyone involved to be able to be in a system that doesn't have a designated leader, because I wonder if there's an element of our identity that we place in the roles that we fill, And for those who are exceptionally driven or want to move up the ladder, there's something to work towards that kind of we're winning. We're winning
Yeah.
at this.
Right. Yeah,
We're
of course.
elevating, we're raising, we're changing positions, we're learning things. And when all of that is gone, uh, you know, the competition is still against someone else, but can you value them enough to know that they're taking a position of leadership, even if it's just for a time, does not diminish you and your abilities. And I've seen that um, in a couple of situations where maybe all of a sudden a team was kind of made to operate as a functional unit, and one person was put in charge of just facilitating the meetings and the action items.
Yeah.
But that person was lower by a tier or two than other people in that group, but very gifted at facilitation and follow through. Very gifted. So that's why they were put there, so they could keep everyone on track. And the immediate threat to person that was felt, like, it was immediate.
Wow, really?
And oh yeah, because like, well, I'm senior. Why wasn't I put as the lead?
Right.
Well, they haven't even done this. I have done this longer. Why am I not the lead? You're like, this has nothing to do with your ability. And you know, and so I think again that goes all the way back to employee and professional development are
Hmm.
those who have the ability to empower and to build up and to move people in such a way, make those calls. Are we preparing them to thrive when those calls are made and helping them understand their true identity does not lie in that role, which gets into a whole other side of
Yeah,
the
no, I mean
kettle of
it's
worms, but
right,
it's an important
seriously.
part of it.
It's a tough scenario to navigate. I mean, you have to make sure you're giving people, I think what most people want these days is reported as an opportunity for growth is what's most important for people. And then also having a sense
Mhm,
of purpose and value in the job that they're doing.
mhm,
Um, but making sure that you can find it, especially like in a flat structured company, making sure you find ways to fulfill those needs for employees. But at the same time, what you're describing and why this is my reason why I was like, I don't know how well this stuff would work, is because it does require almost everyone to be on the same page in terms of
mhm.
emotional intelligence. And that's just not reality. you know
Right.
we're all able to have a certain level of awareness, and it just is, you need a lot of training in order to be able to function in an environment where it's almost like a commune in a weird way, where
Mhm,
everybody contributes and does their part. And I don't know, it's a tough one to navigate. I think in an ideal world, it's beautiful. I don't know how
mhm.
realistic it is long term for most companies and projects, especially as you grow. It might be
Yeah.
good to find 10 people who are all on the same page and who like a flat structure, and who can all say, like, okay, this person will take the lead here and not have any egotistical reaction to it. But as you grow, you get to 100 people, 1,000 people. It's going to be
Yeah.
really tough to do. So before we wrap up, I think we've had a really good conversation here, and I think there's a lot of little golden nuggets for people to pull out. At the very least, it's just an interesting uh, time to listen to two doctoral students just sort of pontificate on different ideas. By the way, I've always wanted to use that word.
I'm so
Finally,
proud.
finally found a spot to use it. Uh, I want to talk a little bit before we go about power dynamics. And we learned a lot about that last semester. Maybe channel your inner Barbara Kellerman here. But could you tell me how power dynamics have shifted for followers over the last few decades?
Sure. Well, I think that looking at the political scene, um, both nationally and internationally, we can see, and a lot of this, thank you, Barbara Kellerman, for bringing light to a lot of this research, but we can see that there has been a shift from kind of blindly following the leader and assuming that the leader is the one with the answers, the one that we can trust to be doing things with our conglomerate best interest in mind.
Hmm.
And there has been a slow kind of decay of that level of trust and kind of blindly following,
Yeah.
to the point where, you can even, you say the past couple of decades, but even look back at the 60s when everybody was just, we're not taking anything just at face value anymore as what is normal and what we're going to do. We're going to kick the system in every way.
Yeah.
And so in the last couple of decades, I think that there's been that level of, I don't know if you would call it the same kind of enlightenment, but just a choice to call the leaders to a higher standard that the followers determine what that is.
Hmm.
I think some of this has
Accountability.
come, accountability, and that comes with the way that screens and technology have allowed us more insight into these leaders' lives. You can think about presidents in particular, or our social leaders in our city councils and things like that. We have more insight now, and therefore there's a feeling that we have more power to say something about it if they are not operating the way we think they should.
Hmm.
And we see across the board leaders who suffer moral failures or things like that. Those might have been either a given or shoved under a rug several decades ago, but especially now, oh, it's the front page news,
Yeah.
it's cancel culture. No longer are you praised for this long history of workplace achievement. But no, you're a normal person and we don't have to support you in that anymore. For good, bad,
Hmm.
and ugly, it all exists together. And so we can see that decay. And I think that's one reason so much more research is coming out about the importance of followership, because we can see that many things about the way that leadership is continuing from how it's always been is not working. A lot of our systems are breaking down left, right, and center, and it's not working.
Right.
And we care, and we as followers in these systems now have a say, and we want to know why this isn't working, and we want to hold people accountable for that. And we have the ability to do that, sometimes to a detriment. I don't fully agree with the whole cancel culture and the way that it fully sweeps people, but
Sure.
there's an element of underlying truth in that people are craving what is real and what is honest and what is going to make a good change in our world. So when we see something rise up that is an affront to that ideal and that hope, we now see followers in our individual people, in our communities, be it a congregation or a workplace or a political scene. We're stepping up now, and so those leaders are now accountable to us as followers as we hold them accountable,
Yes.
in a different way than I think we saw, you know, before we were born, and then even through our lifetimes. So
So it sounds like the power dynamics have equalized quite a bit, where it was 90% power to the leader, 10% power to the follower. Now it's really getting closer to 50-50, where the follower does have a much bigger say in the relationship and what that looks like than before.
yeah, I think that's probably true. I do wonder kind of, I find the generational spans just
Mhm.
fascinating. Um, and so between millennials, which is where I fall, and those coming after me, there's already a huge shift in expectation for workplace. So I actually kind of wonder if the personal leadership is upping, and so therefore that followership we may start seeing that take over in the percentages, and to where I don't have to work here anymore. There's this thought of I don't have to
Yeah.
work there. I don't have to use my time there. I don't have to respect that person. And there's a breakdown of respect and authority and things which can sometimes be problematic, but is nonetheless here.
Right.
And people they don't have the patience for doing certain things. We're not going to have the same job our whole lives like our grandparents and most of our parents did. It's not that culture anymore. And so it's a little more, well, I just wonder how it's going to continue shifting in that whole multi-generational workforce dynamic, is really going to drive a lot of the success of businesses as the youngers are coming in and feeling like they have so much more say because they've been raised to believe and sometimes actually do have that.
Yeah,
Um, so it's
that's
going to
true.
be wild, as I kind of feel like the way that the leader followership dynamic, maybe it'll oscillate more, but we might be moving into a season where the followers start driving a little bit more and leaders are having to respond to that, so that the percentage might actually shift in favor of the followers for a time while everybody figures out what do we do in this new era of work. It's fascinating.
Yeah, I, I'm going to say sort of two conflicting things here. Because one, I think what we're talking about here speaks to how much of a voice that followers do have in situations. And I think there's a lot of old work styles that are still brought to a lot of organizations and environments these days where they feel as if they are voiceless in most situations, and that's not necessarily reality. And they do have a more of a say of how they're treated and what their work style is going to look like and what what that relationship's going to look like with their boss. The conflicting part is that we as a society right now, unless something changes, we feel, and this is just my opinion, we feel more lost than ever. And maybe what we're actually missing is a good leader and a respect for authority and respect for a leader who can guide us, who does have our best interest in mind. Because I do
Mhm.
think, as followers of just in the general sense of the country, we don't really know what we want. I think what
Yeah.
we want switches constantly. And
Mhm.
um, we feel a little bit lost. And I think we need a good leader. It's been a long time since we've had a really good leader to guide us, that we feel supported
Right.
and cared for by, to guide us towards some type of collective goal that we can all get behind.
I agree.
In a
Yeah, I
weird
agree.
way, I was hoping COVID brought us together and maybe popped out a leader to help guide us and kind of bring us together a lot more as a country or as a globe. Honestly, the entire world is kind of dealing with this. I was hoping that that would have been like the chipping away at a stone of forming a great leader or maybe leaders, but really it
Mhm.
felt like it divided us a bit more, and we feel a little bit lost. So I don't know what the
Mhm.
answer is there. I think we do currently have more of a voice as followers. We can hold people accountable a lot more depending on the situation. At the same time, I think we also may need to trust and listen to some others more, and trust that that other people can help bring out the best in us and bring out the best of our futures as well.
Right. Yeah, I agree. And I think there's a wonderful opportunity for organizations right now. We're all part of an insane political time, being we're
Right.
stepping into this election year. It's only going to get more insane. It doesn't matter which side or middle you fall, we will all feel the insanity increase for the next 10 months. And there's a wonderful opportunity for organizations to rally within themselves and in the direct communities in which they sit. And I have a hope that, as things are chaos around us, at least we in our communities can perhaps rally together, even when those we have to look up to are not doing their jobs well.
Mhm.
And then just treating the whole process rather poorly. That doesn't necessarily mean that we have to reflect those same kind of attitudes, that we could come together. And so maybe it just starts with us, and if we can be a part of organizations that can choose to demonstrate that, the ripple effect will be felt in our community, because systems are systems and they all touch. And so we
Yep.
can start with one, and if we can individually, you're in your area, I'm in mine, we can start here and maybe eventually Texas and Florida will touch, and we will have built something beautiful.
That sounds good to me. I think that's a really good point to end the conversation on. And I love that, leaving us with that note. So I want to say thank you for coming on, first of all. I want to give you an opportunity. I realize I never gave you an opportunity to formally introduce yourself. And so why don't we use this as a chance to plug maybe your website where people can find you and what type of services that you're looking to offer.
Sure. Well, yeah, we were just excited to jump right in.
Yeah.
So I have a coaching and consulting business called The Minded Spaces. My passion is to help people navigate the place in between where they currently are and where they want to be. Usually that's because we're facing some sort of hurdle or some way of not understanding how we can get either ourselves individually or our companies over this hurdle to where our preferred future is. And that's my happy zone. I love living there and walking there with people. Um, my website is theminded, MINDED spaces.com. And yeah, I love working with both individuals and organizations. I particularly love working with the senior leadership team and executive leadership team. I have a passion for helping bring about ways to improve the gap that can come from the communications outside of the C-suite to the rest of the organization. There's often a big gap right there. And a lot of
Yes.
people have no idea how to navigate that. This conundrum everywhere. And I love trying to wheedle in those places with people, and can we figure out how to improve this for your organization? And so those are some particular passions that there's more on my website, and I would love to hear from you sometime.
Awesome. I love that. I think those are some very important services. I've been waiting the entire episode to say this. I love your journey. I love how you went from opera to operations.
I'm a,
Operations.
I'm gonna make a shirt about that.
That sounded better in my head. It didn't actually sound that good when I said it out loud. But anyway, thank you everybody for listening. Annie, thank you for coming on for this
Thanks for
episode.
having me.
Anyone who's listening here to the end, and if you made it this far, do me a favor. If you enjoyed the episode, leave us a 5-star review. If you're watching this on YouTube, please hit like and subscribe. If you did not enjoy the episode, we respect you. Thank you for your opinion, and thank you for listening this entire time. Please don't leave a review, and don't hit that dislike button. Don't be a jerk. Okay? All we're asking. Thank you, everybody. And this has been another episode of The Workplace Wonder.